privilege to announce that Professor Böröcz is going to be the next speaker and the last speaker. And then he has got also a title which is about socialisms without apologies.
Thank you. Question mark.
Question mark.
Thank you very much. I'm just like Nicola, I'm very pleased to be here. I was about to say that I think that the center has tremendous potential. It's a historic event, in fact, in the Hungarian and I would even say East Central European context, in the sense that we have really not had a research institution that focuses on global, historical, comparative, social issues. At least since 1973, when up till that point, Africa and India Research Institute of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences was transformed into a world economy center, and therefore only has been focusing on economic relations and not social. And I really want to thank the organizers. First of all, Attila, with whom we have been talking about something like this for at least 10 years, if not more. We should create something, and now it's happening. I'm blown away. And also everybody else that has been involved in this. And I would like to mention to those of you that are not members of the email list that we have, not yet, that everybody that has been working on this is doing it on a volunteer basis. Nobody has been paid for it. So I'm very grateful just for that. And third, it is really an honor to be part of this panel. The two people that spoke before you are probably the two people I have learned most from in my short and not particularly interesting career. But now I was told that the event today will be mainly focused on discussion, conversation. So I didn't actually bring a paper. In other words, what I'm about to say is not rounded off at all. So instead what I'm going to do is offer us a little bit of a critique of two literatures that are relevant to the topic of the meeting today. And then show one specific set of ways in which a little tiny bit of some of the problems could be corrected. Histories of state socialisms are part of the collective socio-cultural, political and economic heritage of humankind. The fact that this particular system is over in this part of the world is not a reason not to talk about it. That actually is a very good reason to talk about it, because we have now a certain distance from that. State socialism as a term marks that version of modern society which is based on a particular class and exploitation-focused political critique of capitalist society, expressed as a set of large-scale collective experiments in the abolition of, or at least, this is interesting, this thing is shifting the slides on its own somehow. I'm sorry about that. Two slides ahead of me already. It was an experiment, or has been an experiment, in three areas. The abolition of, or at least serious restrictions on private property as a social relation, the curtailment of the control of the market over society in the formal realm, and the expansion of formal structures of rational redistribution, to quote the book that made me a sociologist, as well as informality in general, in other words, including informal markets, redistribution, and reciprocity. In other words, because of its partially antithetical relationship to capitalism, state socialism rounds out the concept of modern society by adding a set of non-private property-based, non-market dominated societies to the already bewildering variety of capitalisms in plural. And yet, if you examine the generic image of modern society that emerges from sociology, mainstream, that image, the generic image of modern society, takes little notice of this important form variant we call state socialism. Now, one generation after the collapse, at least in this part of the world, from here to the Pacific Ocean, we are at a sort of a crucial moment, I think, to do the work that would be necessary to make this particular historical phenomenon sort of enter into a more generic conversation. Why do I think so? Well, first because the political noise and the anxieties about the transformation have subsided by now. We have now other noise and much worse anxieties, actually, at least arguably. The second thing is that archives and various other repositories of knowledge have become more directly available, and one would hope not all of them have been fully forged yet. Meanwhile, we have societies that still have a majority of their members who lived under the state socialist system, so it is actually possible to tap into the collective experiences of these societies in ways that will not be possible, let's say, one generation later. Now, state socialist experiments involved not all, but a set of states in the world. Therefore, when we talk about state socialism, we are actually talking about a unique global embeddedness, the embeddedness of a state socialist sort of enclosure within the otherwise capitalist global system. In other words, it is basically not possible to understand a large part of what happened under state socialism without taking into account this sort of antithetical relationship with the context in which it was embedded. And yet, neither the literature on global issues does take a lot of notice of state socialism, nor do accounts of state socialism pay much attention to the global. So when we move specifically to the question of the place of state socialism in a global, historical, comparative, social analysis, we see two hiatuses. First, the global and historical comparative scholars tend to show little interest in state socialism, and second, experts in state socialism or experts in the areas that have experienced recently state socialism show little excitement about global or historical comparative work. As a result, not all, but a fairly large proportion of work on state socialism employs single developmental path modernizationist models, i.e. a perspective, by the way, that has been abandoned at least one, if not two generations ago, because of its structural flaws. Second, the writing that some of the, say the majority, unfortunately, of the writing resorts to methodological nationalism. In other words, what I mean by that is that they treat their subject as if this nation-state society container was unconnected to the rest of the world. Third, they use imageries of global structures that have large holes in them. They tendentiously leave out entire blocks of human societies. For instance, never enter the concept of capitalism never seems to contain the concept of the third world. Now, the comparisons, there is comparative work, but sometimes the comparisons that do appear are disembedded from the global context and are often poorly specified. Even sometimes, one even gets the feeling that they're tendentious. This is a fairly strong claim, and I will actually give one tiny example of that to illustrate what I have in mind. The next is that that same literature tends to ignore the linkages among the cases, in other words, the interconnectedness of the cases, even in small n studies. Studies which, the problem, of course, if you have large n studies, in other words, you study the world as a whole with 200 cases of, say, nation-state, it's a little complicated and gets really dense to try to take account of the complex intricate linkages among them. But a large number of studies actually don't do that huge n approach. They actually have a different approach, and the small n studies could perfectly easily afford a network approach, and they don't do it. Or tend to sort of background it and make employ fairly strong assumptions about them. The same literature, a part of this literature, relies on a simplistic, what I call totalitarianism framework, which is something that often relies on fairly undifferentiated, rather moralistic dismissals instead of systematic and even-handed critiques of the state socialist object of analysis. Now, all of this combined leads to portrayals of state socialism that are those of embarrassing aberrations. This jumped quite a bit now. Okay. Actually, you know what? This was not such a bad moment. Instead, and here I have a little list of the sort of what I think we might want to sort of do instead. We might want to consider trying to make sure that our work treats, that our work is sensitive to the global embeddedness of the cases, treat the local as an instance of the global and the global as an instantiation of the local and vice versa, complicated sort of recursive models of that kind. Work that employ closely controlled comparisons. I'll try to give one example. This is not the last word about this, of course, but just I'll try to show you something what I have in mind here. Work that resists moralizing and treats state socialism as a set of instances of the modern social form. What I will do in the rest of my time is give you two examples, mainly something about how to control, something about critique of a particular, I think, misspecified comparison and control, and sort of how to fix that. That would be most of it, and then I'll say maybe one or two sentences about linkages. This table comes from a book written in the second half of the 1980s, published in 1990 by a major American university press. The author is a very, very, very highly regarded institutional economist, somebody who has a long track record of writing about state socialism, nominated for the Nobel Prize several times. Some of you may recognize what the book is that I'm quoting from here. It doesn't really matter. Okay? The point is not that I want to talk about the person here. I'm showing you an instance of something. This is a table, actually one of two. I'll show you another one. Both of them are meant to demonstrate the inherent, essential inferiority of socialism versus capitalism. Socialism to capitalism. And the way the tables do that is, in this case, car density. So you have 2 time points, 1990 and 1980 and 1987, and 2 groups of countries: socialist countries, capitalist countries. Socialist countries include Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Yugoslavia. Capitalist countries: Austria, Denmark, Italy, Japan, and so on. Now, if this was to come to me in the form of a graduate student paper, if a graduate student were to develop an analysis from this, I would return it to them. For the simple reason that this makes a very simple mistake. Right? It leaves out an important variable that would control for the results. How do we know that the differences, which are obvious, right? There's a much greater density of cars in the capitalist countries than in the socialist countries. How do we know that is a result of the capitalism-state socialism contrast and not the result of some other variable? What is that other variable? I mean, I'm sure all of you know what I'm talking about. It's something about GDP per capita or some measure of what is called socioeconomic development. I mean, it's pretty obvious that richer countries would spend, I mean, what does it mean to be richer? You are able to consume more. Right? So it's a consumption variable here. So you might want to control for that and then see what the residual effect of state socialism is. Right? Once you control for that. Now there are 2 ways of doing that. You can put the whole thing into a large data set of all countries. It's very tedious. Probably data are not that available. Another way to do that is to just look at your data, the ones that you have. And so I did the audacity of actually looking up the relevant data. So this is the first graph that I constructed. And it was the horizontal axis is GDP per capita as expressed as percent of the world mean in that year, and the vertical axis is the numbers here, that's car density. lo and behold, there are a couple of absolutely fascinating things that we can learn about state socialism and capitalism that we do not learn from the table. For instance, the most striking thing for me, for my money, is that these 12 or so cases, or something like that, show that state socialism and capitalism seem to be more or less exactly on the same regression line. So if anything, what we learned is that they're basically, the state socialist societies were strikingly similar to capitalism. It's just that they are, the cases that we have are quite a bit poorer. Okay? The same applies to the other time point, 1987. I would be hard-pressed to find a major, I don't think I could write a paper about the difference from this data. The data seem to indicate that there is a breathtaking similarity between the two. And that is the exact opposite of what the conclusion is that is offered in this book. The book claims that these data, without the graph, just the numbers, show that state socialism has an inherent inability to provide consumption. The same is true, there's another table here, which is that of telephone lines, main lines per 100 inhabitants. Again, a very similar story happens. To the author's credit, in this particular table, he did include Turkey, which is a relatively less affluent capitalist state, although by far not among the poorest. So that would be this graph, which is more or less the same conclusion, except that there is one case of a state socialist society which seems to have a higher telephone density than a richer capitalist state. So that the black triangles are the capitalist states and the empty circles are the socialist ones. Now, I don't really have a big theory about phone density or any such thing, but the point is that it's fascinating stuff, but it doesn't seem to support the conclusion that is drawn. Now, what alternative can we take? Well, there are many. Here's one I'm going to run through just very quickly in a very sketchy way. One way to approach this is to look at the distribution of the world states and look at state socialist societies. My purpose here is to find proper comparisons for the state socialist work. And so this is a graph. This is, for those of you that have been subjected to my book, I apologize, but the data have been quite explicitly discussed there. The vertical axis is per capita GDP expressed as percentage of the world mean. This is for 1950. The horizontal, so that's a measure of, relative wealth, conventional measure. And the horizontal axis shows the share of each of these economies in the total world product. And so I consider that as a not perfect, nothing is perfect, but it's sort of an okay, for now, for my purposes, acceptable measure of relative geopolitical power in the economic realm. That was what share of the world economy does your economy have? So we have a distribution of the world state. The two sets of lines, by the way, this one, the horizontal one, are the mean for that year, and the other one is the median. So we can, this tells you something about the distribution of the world states. Most of the world states are in the poorest and smallest, least powerful part of the world, and that's just how things are. Now the interesting thing is when you start to label them according to capitalism, state socialism. Now the red triangles are the state socialist states, just to give you the others. The blue, the light blue triangles are West European capitalist states, and the four large dark blue squares on the top are what Angus Madison refers to as the Western offshoots. Basically the Anglophone settler colonial successor states. That is United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand on the top. So one thing that we can conclude immediately from this is that there is one regularity about the outbreaks of state socialism as of 1950, and that is that there is not one among them that is really rich. Right? Because the one that is highest in the distribution is CS, that would be Czechoslovakia, 1950. Now, the more interesting story is when how do we make choose comparisons for a small n study? Well, we draw a circle around each, and then see what's inside the circle. How big the circle? It's up to you. I made that totally an arbitrary fashion. This, as I said, it's not a paper. This is just a provocation. It shows, however, that it's exceedingly difficult to compare the USSR to anything, because it just happens to be such an outlier, like a unique case in terms of the combination of its wealth and size. And even for China, it's really difficult to find a real comparative point. I mean, this is India. This is PRC here. A really poor but extremely large society, therefore it's a very significant player in the world, even in 1950. And this is India. So, borderline. Now, the more exciting thing is, as a gesture to my fellow Hungarians, I thought that I would just examine Hungary from close up here. So I drew a little that circle around Hungary. That's how it looks. So the proper comparison, if you wish to study the comparative performance of the socialist economy in the case of Hungary, would be Peru, Portugal, Colombia, and South Africa. I would like to stop and let it settle for a second. Because, this is what the data gives. 1950, that is the year after the communist takeover in this part of the world. Now, there are two things one can do with this, and the next thing is going to be extremely sketchy, so please forgive me. Okay, I don't really stand by it, but I thought it was interesting. One thing would be to look at the post-1950 history and the relative amount of brutality that happened in these societies. Let's say generalized political violence and instability that is directly threatening the security and safety of survival of populations. Well, in the Hungarian case, arguably from 1950, we had a few years of Stalinism, then an uprising, repression of that uprising, and a fairly painful and slow thaw, so that it wasn't until 1961, something like that, the so-called Kádár normalization, quote unquote, was taking place. And after that, it's really difficult to find actual instances of life-threatening physical violence and politically motivated and the like. Now, here comes Colombia, Portugal, Peru, and South Africa. You understand what I'm trying to do here. Again, please don't take me to task for the details here. It's a little bit sketchy. I'm not an expert on any of these, but just a very cursory look at the history of Colombia shows that they had a 1958 to 1964 period when there was no civil war going on. And during this 50-something year period, that is the period of state socialism that we're trying to compare on, the large part of their history is marked by armed struggle, guerrilla war, and the emergence of the worst known case of drug trafficking. Right? If we look at Peru, a very similar story. We look at Portugal, well, Portugal, a different story. This happens to be one of the worst colonial repressors. Most of the time that is marked as colonial rule is actually colonial war, dirty war, genocidal war that was going on, and the Salazar fascist dictatorship. And then there's a Carnation Revolution, 1974, and the sudden normalization of political life and liberation of the former colonies, a huge reflux of colonial Portuguese back to Portugal, and the takeoff of the EU, approaching the EU membership and democratic Portugal. And then the final case is South Africa. I think it's a particularly obvious case. The entire period is that of apartheid. A large part of it is armed struggle. Now, another way to sort of goal that we can use this comparison for is to actually examine the economic performance of these economies, which is kind of what I was sort of starting out with. And so here's the story for the little circle around Hungary. Maybe I'll enlarge that. Okay, I'll enlarge that later. The red line is the one that marks Hungary there. So there is a fairly strong increase in wealth in the early period. And then more or less things sort of hover around the same level, except that there is a clear tendency of losing ground in terms of geopolitical weight. Notice the Hungarian economy is becoming less and less. It wasn't exactly that significant to begin with, and then it's just going to kind of had something, by the end of this period, it had something like 2.5 times less of an economic weight as it had in 1950, globally speaking. And then this is the post-state socialist period. In the case of Hungary, sudden drop and rebound, but the rebound never reaches the state socialist levels, has not reached it. And meanwhile, the trend of losing ground globally continues. Okay? Smaller and smaller proportion of the world economy. To look at it more closely, we can now compare Hungary to its comparable capitalist partners. Well, Portugal definitely beat us quite a bit. We put a blue line here. And but at the same time, there's something to be pondered when you look at Peru and Colombia and South Africa as well. So the conclusion that you would want to come away with from this is that, well, it was really not that terrible. I mean, it was okay. It could have been better. It could have been Portugal. But we didn't have access to the resources of, the diamond producing regions of Africa, and somehow it didn't happen. Not that I think we should have, but you understand. And the third one is the post-state socialist comparison. It's sort of enlarged. Again, the real story here is that the post-state socialist pattern seems actually to be vaguely, reminiscent of that of Portugal. They also went down and losing ground, and so on. There's not much else to be said about this. I just wanted to put these 4 comparative cases out to you to shock you with that. And finally, another thing that I think, there are two other things I did want to say. So, compared Hungary to the real champions of the state socialist bloc, the 2 cases that show the greatest amount of improvement. That would be Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. The blue one is Yugoslavia, and the left is Bulgaria. Both of them more or less reached the levels that Hungary was on, or it's just that they started from a lot lower, and then sort of tapered off. Another way to look at it is to compare all this to the real champions of the world economy at the time. And those are 3. Japan, South Korea, and Hong Kong. The one on the right is Japan, in the middle is South Korea, and there's Hong Kong. So this calibrates sort of the Hungarian experience, and so this is a good reminder that there's not a lot of reason to celebrate the state socialist achievement either. Right? I mean, this is not very different, a lot more modest than the real winners of the world economy of the time. Now, finally, the two sentences that I wanted to say about connections. Another way to look at the world in a small n way is to look at the ways in which the cases are connected to each other. So I just did a little bit of a play with the graph, linking Hungary to its nothing but its fellow state socialist partners. This would be the CNEA plus a couple other cases which were not members, Laos and Cambodia. And the reason I put it out here is that it really shocked me what a huge territory of the world the socialist bloc connections actually covered. Right? So the connections between Hungary and China involve the link of a medium-sized, medium-income economy to a gigantic, very powerful economy, very powerful, very poor country. This is 1950. Look at the difference between this and the Soviet Union and Hungary. And from this, there's a lot that one can actually play with if one works on, for instance, the history of economic integration within Comecon and the various other topics that need to be covered. And to just finish on a related note, so what Mohua was talking about is this connection from here to there.